On a bright, sunlit morning, the city had yet to shake off the thin mist of the late season. Derek led Caleb to a small pet shop, tucked under the canopy of a bright red maple tree. The soft chime of a wind bell rang gently as they stepped inside, accompanied by the chirping of birds in high cages and the faint smell of dried grass, cat food, and antibacterial soap. Today marked Caleb's 8th birthday, a milestone Derek knew he couldn't celebrate with just another toy like the years before. The boy needed a companion, something alive, something that could share his days, and perhaps a small animal would be the perfect gift. Caleb, dressed in a blue hoodie with messy curls, couldn't hide his excitement. He skipped from one cage to the next, first stopping to watch a kitten chasing a feather, then pausing in front of a few white rabbits with pink eyes nibbling on some greens. Each animal brought a brief moment of joy, but nothing held his attention for more than 3 minutes. Derek stood with his arms crossed behind him, trying to appear patient, even as his gaze quickly darted to the clock. "Pick something soon. We still have to get back and bake the cake," he reminded him, half gently, half urging. But then, as if drawn by some unseen force, Caleb suddenly stopped, stepping back from the row of well-lit cages and turning into a shadowy corner of the store. There was no glittering light or cheerful sound, just a large cage pressed against the wall, far from the other animals. Inside, a large German shepherd, its fur a mix of gray and gold, lay curled up, facing the corner, silent enough that one might mistake it for a stone statue. Caleb didn't hear any growling, didn't see a wagging tail, and didn't catch any eyes until he stepped a little closer. Those eyes that had seen too much that no animal should ever have to witness, slowly flickered. Just a brief flash of movement, but Caleb stepped back, his heart racing in an unusual way. Not from fear, but from sadness. A strange sorrow flooded his chest, an unnamed feeling that made him want to sit right there in complete silence and stay. "That dog's name is Milo," a store employee approached, her voice low but gentle. "We bought him from a rescue center after his previous owner was investigated for animal abuse. He was kept in darkness for too long. Doesn't trust people, doesn't eat when someone's near. Honestly, no one has wanted to adopt him for months." Derek heard and walked over, glancing through the metal bars. "That dog looks dangerous," he murmured, stepping back as if to keep a safe distance from his son. "We're here to pick an animal that can play with you. Let's choose one of those cute puppies over there." But Caleb didn't hear him anymore. He stood there, still in front of Milo, his eyes fixed on the still, curled form that seemed to shrink away from the world. There was something inside him that told him, this dog should not be forgotten. No one knew what made Caleb's gaze shift at that very moment, from curiosity to quiet, from excitement to focus. But it was clear that, from that instant on, he had found what he needed, even if he couldn't yet name it. And Milo, though he didn't turn his head, though he didn't wag his tail, shifted his ears slightly when Caleb sat down just a short distance away from the cage. The glass door of the pet store closed softly behind Caleb, the chime of the wind bell ringing faintly like a quiet farewell. Caleb turned back one last time, looking toward the shadowed corner where the German shepherd still lay motionless in its cage. Milo didn't turn his head, didn't follow. But in the final moment before he disappeared from view, Caleb thought he caught a fleeting glance, a look that seemed to say, as if the dog had once hoped someone would come back. Derek hurried towards the parking lot, his hand brushing lightly over the car keys as though he wanted to close the door on their brief visit. He didn't say anything as his son followed slowly behind, but when Caleb climbed into the car and turned to glance back again, he sighed. "Caleb, listen to me," Derek began, his voice trying to stay calm. "That dog, it's not a good choice. It has problems, many problems. If you want a pet, pick one that can play with you, not one that always cowers like it's about to be beaten." Caleb didn't respond. He stared out the window, his gaze distant, as if he were still somewhere in the small room with the scent of dried grass and the soft breathing. "But did you see its eyes?" he spoke after a while. It was like it had been abandoned too many times, to the point where it didn't dare hope anymore. Derek chuckled softly, but it was a tired laugh. You're imagining things. It's just a wounded dog. And maybe it attacked someone, which is why it was left behind. We don't know what happened to it. But one thing I know for sure, we don't need more trouble. I'm not going to help you take care of it, Caleb. Silence filled the rest of the drive. Caleb didn't say another word. He just sat still, his hand tightly clutching the corner of his shirt. But in his mind, the image of the dog with its gray and gold fur, curled body, and defensive eyes remained vivid, as if it were imprinted deep in his memory. That night, the small house in the suburbs was quiet as usual. Caleb ate dinner in silence, not running around the living room like he usually did, not turning on the TV to watch his favorite cartoons. Derek thought his son had gotten over it. He believed, as he had in the past, that the impulsive enthusiasm of childhood would soon be replaced by something newer. But what Derek didn't know was that in his small bedroom, under the soft glow of his desk lamp, Caleb was doing something he had never done before. The blank page in his notebook slowly began to form shaky lines. At first it was just a simple circle, and then he added ears, a nose, the thin back, the drooping tail, and the eyes. The eyes he couldn't forget. This was the first time Caleb had drawn a dog, and he didn't need to look at a reference, didn't need to imagine. Every detail, every line was already in his heart from the moment that look passed by. Right beneath the drawing, he scribbled a small note in uneven handwriting. The dog doesn't trust anyone, but I want it to know. There's one person who won't leave. Downstairs, Derek sat in the dark of the living room, a cold cup of coffee in his hand. Perhaps he understood that his son had thought about that dog more than he should have. But in his eyes, a child couldn't grasp the responsibility of caring for an animal that had been deeply scarred, like Milo. He hoped that in a few days, Caleb would forget. He would find interest in a new toy or a cute kitten from the pet shop. A week passed, but in Caleb's mind, the image of the German shepherd with its empty gaze still lingered, as if some invisible thread had tied Caleb's heart to it. Every morning when he woke up, every time he saw his collection of favorite figurines on the bookshelf, there was something missing. Derek didn't bring up the subject again. He thought his son had stopped thinking about it. And that weekend, as promised, he suggested they all go to the supermarket for some shopping, and then stop by the pet store to pick up Caleb's late birthday gift that they hadn't gotten before. Caleb nodded, but in his eyes, the light came from another reason. "Dad," Caleb spoke up as they were about to get in the car, his voice small, as if unsure. Can we stop by the pet store? I still haven't gotten my birthday gift. Maybe this time I'll find what I really want." Derek furrowed his brows but nodded. Just for a little while. No more begging after that. Caleb smiled faintly, but that smile quickly faded into a nervous uncertainty. He wasn't sure if Milo would still be there. He didn't know if, when he saw the dog again, it would even remember the glance he had given it. The pet store wasn't crowded that day. The familiar sound of the wind chime and the soft scent of dried grass still filled the air. But Caleb didn't run around the store like he usually did. He walked straight to the shadowed corner where the cage had once sat, silent and forgotten. And Milo was still there. The dog still faced the wall, but its back was no longer curled as it had been the first time. Its legs were stretched out, as if it had allowed itself to relax a little in a world it didn't trust much. Caleb stepped forward, his heel brushing lightly against the tile floor, making a soft sound. Milo turned its ear. Just one, then tilted its head, giving a glance. It wasn't a fearful look, nor one of anger. Just surprise. "Is he still here?" Caleb turned back to ask, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and worry. The store employee, the man with tired but gentle eyes, nodded and placed a folder on the counter. "Yes, but not for long. The manager said if no one adopts him by the weekend, we'll have to transfer him to another center, one that specializes in difficult cases." "Transferred?" Caleb asked, unable to believe what he was hearing. "To Where? To a center farther away. A few hours' drive. It has a separate isolation area for deeply scarred animals, but most of them will stay there forever. Caleb swallowed hard. His hand tightened around the edge of his shirt. Then, almost reflexively, he reached for his father's hand. He looked up at Derek, his eyes uncertain but determined. "I just need one chance," Caleb said, his voice trembling but clear. "One chance to prove that Milo isn't dangerous, that he deserves a family." Derek was momentarily taken aback by the look in his son's eyes. This look was different from the usual pleading Caleb gave when asking for a toy or a trip. This look wasn't just about desire. It carried something deeper. Determination. And responsibility. Caleb ... Derek sighed softly. "Taking care of a dog isn't easy, especially one like him. Are you sure you understand that?" The boy nodded firmly, without hesitation. "If no one else will do it for him, then I will. He just needs one person who won't abandon him again." That statement, in some way, caused Derek to fall silent for a long while. He looked back at the dog in the cage. Still silent, still distant. But this time, his eyes didn't just see a mute animal. He saw a living being, holding on to the last remnants of trust, so fragile that if no one reached out to it, it would vanish forever. Derek turned to the store employee. "If I let my son try and interact with him, will it be safe?" The employee nodded slowly, almost as if he had been hoping for this moment for a long time. "Milo hasn't bitten or attacked anyone. He's just scared. If you leave him be, he won't react. But if anyone is too loud or makes sudden movements, he'll shrink away or run." Caleb took a step toward the large cage, but as soon as he neared, Milo suddenly tensed, curling into himself just as he had when they first met. His ears flattened, his eyes gleamed with fear, not anger, just pure defense. It was as if every movement around him was a shadow of past memories, waiting to come crashing down on him at any moment. "Do you see that?" Derek said, about to pull his son back. "It's clear that he's unstable." "No, that's not it, Dad." Caleb quickly interrupted, not taking his eyes off Milo. "He's not angry. He's just scared. He probably thinks we're going to be like the others. But if we don't try to get to know him, how will he ever know what's different?" "All right," Derek said slowly, his gaze lingering on Caleb. "We'll give it a try, but just a try. If the dog shows any sign of danger, you have to promise me you'll let the adults step in. Do you agree?" Caleb nodded rapidly, his lips curving into a smile, but his eyes were brimming with unshed tears. He turned back to look at Milo, whispering through the glass. "We have a chance now. And this time, I won't let them take you away." Time in the pet store seemed to slow down. The soft ticking of the clock blended with the rustling sound of the cages, the faint swishing of kittens' tails, and the shuffle of people moving past the checkout counter. But in the deepest corner of the shop, between two beings facing each other through a quiet cage, nothing was rushed. There was only an 8-year-old boy sitting upright, his hands neatly placed on his knees, and a large dog, still carrying the scars in its eyes, slowly letting down the invisible shield it had surrounded itself with. Caleb remained still, as if the whole world outside had faded into a blur. He didn't speak, nor did he move, but inside him there was a storm, of nervousness, of waiting, and of a small hope being carefully nurtured, second by second. Inside the cage, Milo's breathing grew calmer. He didn't move, but he was no longer trembling like before. His body still faced the wall, but his ears had shifted, now turned toward Caleb. Derek, who had initially stood there expecting his son to get bored and stand up, also remained motionless. He watched everything with a pensive gaze. There was something in that silence that made his heart soften, as though he was seeing himself from the past, when he was young enough to believe that just being there for someone long enough would make them stop feeling lonely. The store employee, who had no idea when he had started standing by the door, still held the notepad in his hand, but was no longer focused on reading. He whispered softly, "Your son. There's something special about him. Most kids would want the animal to come running to hug them, or at least wag its tail. But your boy, he just sits and waits. Derek didn't reply. He just watched Caleb. And when he saw Milo turn his head and glance at his son, he held his breath. There was no noise, no barking, no excited tail wagging like in the movies. But that gaze, Milo's eyes, lingered on Caleb for a second longer. It was no longer angry, no longer defensive. Just a curious look, hesitant. But it didn't look away. Caleb seemed to catch the signal between the two hearts. He smiled softly, tilting his head toward the cookie that lay quietly a hand's breadth away from the cage. "I think he's thinking it over," Caleb whispered to his father, as if afraid to startle Milo. "He knows I'm not rushing him." Derek exhaled softly. "It's just a look, Caleb. You can't read too much into it." "It's not just a look, Dad," Caleb whispered, his eyes still fixed on Milo. "It's the look of someone who wants to try again, but they need time." The store employee gently approached and gave a subtle signal to Derek. "If you want, we have a small room for introductions. Your son can interact more closely with Milo in a safe environment. If he's as patient as this, I think he deserves a chance." Derek looked at his son, then back at the dog in the cage. Neither of them spoke, but the fragile connection between them, perhaps it had already surpassed anything rational. He nodded. 10 minutes later, in a quiet room with soft padded floors and gentle lighting, Caleb sat in a corner. Milo was brought in on a leash, the employee holding the lead. The dog stiffened as it crossed the threshold, eyes darting around, breath shallow. Caleb stayed still, leaning against the wall, his hands placed neatly on his knees like before. He didn't move closer, didn't call out. He just observed in silence. "I know you're scared. I was scared the first time I went to a new school too," Caleb spoke softly, his voice blending into the peaceful atmosphere. "But sometimes, if you sit next to someone who won't leave, things get a little better." Milo didn't respond. He remained curled on the floor, his body trembling slightly with every breath. His eyes were fixed ahead, but not on Caleb, on the small dog biscuit placed in front of him. Caleb took a few steps back. He knew that any sudden movement could make Milo run away. His small legs struggled to maintain balance, but he didn't dare do anything more than wait. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Milo stared at the biscuit. Once, twice. He didn't lunge for it, didn't lick his lips like most dogs would. Instead, his body stayed tense, his ears flattened, his eyes full of doubt, almost anguish, as if he were standing before an invisible trap where every act of kindness had a cost. He moved one paw forward, then stopped. His head lowered, his nose gently nudging the biscuit's edge, but his whole body remained half in, half out of decision. Caleb didn't say anything. He just stayed still, his hands tightly clutching his shirt, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that if he took even half a step forward, everything would fall apart. And then, very slowly, Milo stretched his neck toward the biscuit, his nose trembling as it gently touched the edge, then pulling back, before inching forward again. A soft breath escaped from his throat, as if he was trying to reassure himself. Finally, just as Caleb was holding his breath, Milo licked the biscuit. Slowly, not hurriedly, not excitedly, but as an action made with choice. No one said anything. The employee, for the first time, smiled faintly. Derek, standing behind the glass, felt something inside him stir. Something old, something soft, something he had long forgotten. Caleb looked up, his eyes brighter than ever. He turned to the glass door, whispering like a promise. "I told you, Dad. He's not dangerous. He just needed to trust, just one more time." When the last cookie was finished by Milo, Caleb didn't rush to speak. He just watched the dog for a long while, his eyes filled with an indescribable sense of relief. It wasn't because a dog ate a cookie. It was because the friend he trusted didn't turn away. Outside the glass window, Derek stood frozen. He didn't understand why he was so still. Perhaps because what had just transpired in that quiet room didn't feel like a simple introductory session. It felt more like a ritual, where a closed heart had just cracked open a tiny gap, enough for the first light to shine through. When Caleb emerged from the room, his eyes sparkling, his cheeks flushed with excitement, Derek looked at his son, then back at the dog being gently led back to its familiar cage. But this time, Milo didn't resist. He didn't struggle, didn't growl or turn away. He just walked slowly, his eyes still following Caleb. "Did you see, Dad?" Caleb whispered, tugging at his father's sleeve. "He's not scary. He just needed the first person who wouldn't leave him." Derek lowered his head to look at his son. Those clear eyes didn't know how to lie, nor did they know how to fake anything. They only knew how to place all their trust in what the heart sensed. He sighed softly. "Taking care of an animal like that? It's not easy, you know that." Caleb nodded without hesitation. "That's why I need your help. We'll do it together, won't we?" Derek gave a faint smile, but inside, a strange feeling rose. Part emotion, part fear, and a lot of uncertainty. He had once thought he was too busy, too tired, too practical to get involved with a dog that had been so hurt. But in that moment, when he saw his son standing tall, eyes never leaving Milo, he realized that some things couldn't be measured by the weight they carried. They were measured by the opportunity they offered. An hour later, in the small office at the end of the hallway, Derek signed the adoption papers. His hand trembled slightly, but he didn't stop. On the way home, the atmosphere in the car was quieter than usual. Milo was placed in a separate cage in the back compartment. Caleb sat next to the cage, his hands intertwined, occasionally leaning down to peer through the bars. But the dog still didn't react. No barking, no whimpering, no raising of his head. He just lay still, like a stone that could breathe, his eyes gazing through everything without truly seeing anything. "Do you want to hear some music?" Caleb asked softly. No response. He quietly played a soft song and began murmuring about the house they were going to. There would be a warm living room, an apple tree in the backyard, and a bed made of old blankets that he planned to lay right next to his own. "I know you don't trust anyone, but I won't hurt you," Caleb said, almost whispering, as if sending a silent promise into the air. Derek, sitting in the driver's seat, glanced quietly into the rearview mirror. He couldn't understand how Caleb could form such a bond with a creature he had only met a few times. And he didn't understand why, for the first time in many years, he had chosen to listen to his son's heart. When they arrived home, Derek carefully opened the trunk. Milo didn't move. Caleb gently bent down, not touching the dog, just sitting quietly next to the cage, murmuring a few words, as if reassuring both the dog and himself. 10 minutes later, Milo slowly stood up and, step by step, walked into the house on the leash. The house, usually quiet, became even more so with Milo's presence, like an emptiness that hadn't yet been filled. Caleb led Milo into the living room, then placed a soft rug near the corner of the wall, beside a bowl of water and a small food tray. "This is your spot," he said, then stepped back, giving Milo the space to choose. But the dog didn't step onto the rug. Instead, he circled around in a small loop, then lay down just beside the threshold, his head turned toward Caleb, not exactly alert, but full of hesitation. Derek stood in the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't enter. He just watched, his gaze thoughtful. Inside him, 100 unanswered questions remained. Am I doing the right thing? Can I truly take responsibility for this? But when he heard Caleb laugh softly because Milo had turned his head to look at him once more, he knew, at least, his son's heart had found something it needed. When Caleb first brought Milo home, he had imagined so many possibilities. He envisioned walking the dog around the neighborhood, tossing a ball in the yard, and waking up every morning to find Milo curled up at the foot of his bed like a close friend. But as the first few days passed in silence, Caleb came to understand. No matter how spacious and warm the house was, it couldn't become a home for a creature that had learned to live in fear. From the very first night, Caleb prepared everything for Milo. A soft bed placed right next to his own, an old blanket that smelled like his clothes, and a few new toys Derek had bought when they left the pet store, though he had still been hesitant at that time. Caleb even carefully placed a bowl of water and a small food tray next to the bed, as if to tell the dog, "Here, no one forces anyone, but if you want, everything is ready." But Milo only lay by the door, not stepping into the room. The entire night, he didn't sleep, nor did he bark. He just stayed still, breathing softly like a shadow. The next morning, the food was still untouched. At first, Caleb thought perhaps Milo wasn't used to it. But by the third day, the fourth day, and then an entire week, Caleb began to realize something else. Milo wouldn't eat if anyone was in the room. It was only when the house was empty, when the footsteps faded down the hall, that Milo would cautiously crawl to the food tray, nibbling at the pieces as if afraid someone might suddenly take it away. And whenever someone opened the door, whether it was Caleb or anyone else, the dog would immediately stop eating, retreat to a corner, and lie flat against the floor with hollow eyes, as if just one wrong move could pull him back into a dark past. Caleb's heart sank every time this happened. He still placed the food in the same spot, stepped back, and waited outside the door. Some days, Milo ate. Other days, he didn't. But Caleb didn't give up. "It's okay," he would often whisper when leaving the room, his voice soft like a lullaby. "I'm not angry. Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." But that patience, no matter how quiet, couldn't hide the weariness that crept in. Worse still, Milo carried a deep fear of water. The first time Caleb turned on the shower in the bathroom, the dog suddenly jumped up, his whole body stiffened, and he bolted under the dining table, the darkest place in the house. There, he trembled violently, ignoring calls and refusing anyone to come near. When the dishwasher started its hum, Milo would panic, panting, his ears flattened against his head, eyes darting around as if he were being drowned by some terrible memory. Caleb tried turning off the faucet, speaking softly, and comforting him, but nothing worked. It was as if Milo couldn't hear anything anymore. "This dog is broken," Derek muttered after the third time, seeing Milo bolt at the sound of running water. He didn't try to hide his frustration anymore. Caleb heard those words. He didn't respond, didn't argue. But something inside him shattered. Not because his father was angry, but because he was angry with himself, for thinking that love alone could heal everything. Time passed. 1 week, 2 weeks, then 3. Milo remained the same. He didn't get closer, didn't play, didn't look anyone in the eye except Caleb. And even then, he only looked from a great distance. One day, Caleb threw a soft ball into the backyard, where he usually played. He turned to Milo, giving a gentle wave. "Want to try?" Milo didn't move. Caleb sat under the tree the whole afternoon, waiting. The ball remained untouched, and the sun slowly sank. By the 4th week, nothing had changed. And for the first time, Caleb felt so sad that he skipped dinner. He silently pushed his plate away, looked at Milo, who was still curled up in the hallway corner, then stood up and walked straight to his room. Derek watched him, about to say something, but then he didn't. Later, Derek moved over to where Milo was lying, crouching down and gently touching the soft blanket that Caleb still carefully shook out every day. He looked at the dog, still curled up, eyes betraying no emotion except the same old wariness. "That boy trusts you more than anyone," Derek whispered, half to Milo, half to himself. "And I don't know how to help him if you keep being like this." Milo didn't respond, but his ears twitched slightly. At the same time, in the small bedroom, Caleb sat by the window, his hand scribbling on a blank page. It wasn't a drawing, like usual. It was just a figure of a dog curled up, with a small house above it. Below, he wrote, "You don't need to be fast, but I won't leave." And that was the only thing that kept him from crying in the middle of the night. Maybe the house wasn't a home yet. Maybe Milo's heart was still closed. But somewhere, where patience was still believed in, things that hadn't happened yet, just hadn't happened yet. And Caleb still believed. As long as Milo stayed, he would wait. The house remained submerged in quiet days, Not exactly peaceful, but not chaotic enough to change anything either. Milo still kept his quiet habits, only eating when everyone had left the room, only walking when no one was watching, and still retreating into the darkest corners whenever there was the sound of running water or something falling. Derek tried not to complain anymore, but sometimes his gaze would drift away when he saw Caleb sitting alone beside the dog, speaking to him in one-sided conversations as if it were the most normal thing in the world. For Derek, that silence was difficult to understand, but for Caleb, it was the only language Milo could hear at this point. That afternoon, the weather was cool and overcast. Derek was tidying up the old shed behind the house, filled with items that hadn't been touched in ages. The old wooden door creaked with each opening and closing. Caleb sat on the porch, watching Milo lying quietly on the doorstep, his gaze occasionally turning toward Caleb, as if checking that he was still there. Then, bang! A loud noise rang out as a long wooden beam slid off its rack and crashed to the concrete floor. Everything after that happened too quickly. Milo stood up straight, as if shocked by electricity. In less than a second, he bolted off the porch like a shadow, bursting through the half-closed screen door and disappearing out the front gate, leaving behind a quiet breeze. "Milo!" Caleb shouted, throwing his sketchbook aside and running after him. Derek froze for a second, then grabbed the keys and ran after his son. The sun was dipping behind the trees. The fading light turned into a soft, melancholy orange. Caleb ran down the dirt road, his heart pounding loudly. Each turn, each sound made him look back. He called out, his throat raw. "Milo, it's me, it's Caleb, I'm here!" No one responded. Only the rustling grass and the wind brushed past his ears. The bushes along the road turned darker in the dimming light. A few neighbors helped by asking around, but no one had seen the large brown and black dog running through. It was as if Milo had vanished into thin air, as if he had never existed in their lives. Derek drove around the neighborhood, occasionally calling out through the open window, but his voice was growing hoarse too. Inside, a sense of unease settled, both worried and angry at himself for not having foreseen this. Caleb kept running. Even though his legs ached and sweat soaked his shirt, he didn't stop searching. He crossed through an empty lot, followed the edge of the wild grass, and stopped at the small canal where they had walked together last weekend. There, under the fading sunset, was a familiar shadow. Milo. He was crouched by the edge of the water, his body pressed low to the ground as if trying to make himself disappear. His head was bowed, his tail tightly curled. But what made Caleb choke up was the look in his eyes. It wasn't just fear. It was panic, shaped by memories. It was the look of someone who had been submerged in water, beaten, and now only knew how to tremble at the sound of water rippling by the canal. Caleb stopped, no longer calling the dog's name. He took off his shoes and stepped carefully into the cold water, moving slowly so as not to make a sound. When the water reached his ankles, he turned to face Milo, not moving close, not reaching out too quickly, just standing there. "I know you're scared," Caleb whispered, like speaking to a friend who had just had a nightmare. "I was scared too, really scared, when I got lost in the supermarket. I thought I'd never see Dad again. But he came. He didn't leave. And I know. There's someone who will stay." He took another step forward, then stopped. The water glistened with the pale orange light of the setting sun. The wind blew gently, tousling his hair. Caleb placed his hand over his chest, not gesturing, just resting it where his heart thudded incessantly. "I'm not forcing you, but if you want, I'll be here, until you trust me." Milo didn't move, but his ears twitched slightly. His dark brown eyes seemed to blink briefly, then widen a little. He didn't look directly at Caleb, but he didn't run away either. 1 minute passed. 2 minutes. 3 minutes. Caleb still stood in the freezing water, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Milo, the trembling figure by the edge of the grass. His heart beat faster, each thump tightening. Over the nearly month-long time living with Milo, Caleb had never felt fear like this. Not fear of what the dog might do, but fear of one thing, that Milo wouldn't come back. Day after day, Caleb had patiently waited for the dog to eat, patiently sat beside him without saying a word, patiently taken each small step toward healing that wounded heart. But today, when the loud sound startled Milo into a panicked flight, as if running from an old nightmare, everything felt like it was falling apart. Caleb suddenly realized all the things he had built up over the past weeks might just be an illusion. Had he done something wrong? Had he been too hasty? Would Milo vanish like the wind, like everyone else who had abandoned him? Caleb bit his lip lightly, not daring to move. He knew clearly. Just one hasty call, one step too close. That would be enough to make the dog flinch and run away, never to return. And everything would end. Not because Milo didn't want to trust, but because the world had taught him that trusting would only lead to pain. He looked at Milo, curled up, his thin shoulders stiffened as if carrying the weight of a lifetime of untold suffering. Caleb didn't know when, but in his eyes, the dog was no longer just a pet. He was a living being, who felt, who hurt, and who was afraid, just like Caleb had felt when he was lost in the supermarket, panicking, searching for his father in a sea of strangers. And just like that day, Caleb silently wished that someone wouldn't leave. "I'm not forcing you," Caleb whispered, his wet hand trembling but still resting lightly on his chest. "I'll be here, until you trust me." The evening breeze blew through, carrying the scent of damp earth and the fading sunlight spilling over the water. No one said anything. No one did anything. But in the space between a child waiting and a creature in pain, something was slowly shifting. The cold water still stung Caleb's feet, but he no longer paid attention. From this close distance, he could clearly see Milo's eyes, still wary, still full of doubt, but no longer as dark as before. In that gaze, Caleb saw something small, fragile, but truly there, a flicker of hesitation, between running away and staying. The evening breeze brushed over the surface of the lake, making the water ripple gently against the shore. Caleb stood still, letting his wet trousers cling tightly to his legs, his lips pale from the cold, just breathing slowly and softly. He knew that if he rushed anything now, everything could crumble, just like it had the first time they met. One more minute passed. Caleb lowered his head slightly, no longer looking directly at Milo. He feared the dog might think that was a threat. His voice was hoarse from both the cold and his emotions, but it still carried a gentle, instinctive warmth. "I won't do anything. I just want to take you home." Milo shifted slightly. He moved a little closer to Caleb. His eyes were still wide open, but no longer jumping in alarm with every movement Caleb made. His legs still shook, but he no longer turned away. Caleb slowly knelt down, the water now reaching his knees, his small hands reaching out in front of him, palms facing down on the ground, just like the first time in the introduction room. "I'm still here, just like I was before," he whispered. "If you glanced at me then, today, you can touch me." Milo stood there for a long time. He watched Caleb's hands placed lightly in the water. A drop of water fell from his chin, dissolving into the still surface. Then, as if the tight string that had been pulled inside him finally loosened, Milo took a step forward. A small one, but clear. His head lowered gradually, and once again Caleb did nothing. He just exhaled softly, his gaze calming, as if saying with all his heart, "It's okay." And then, the touch. Milo's wet, furry head brushed gently against Caleb's leg, not forcefully, not eagerly, but like a soft branch brushing the water after a breeze. Caleb almost dared not breathe. He only tightened his hand slightly, not hugging, not forcing, just holding the moment like a miracle. Milo didn't pull his head away. Instead, he lightly rested it on Caleb's leg, a gesture so unexpected that Caleb almost cried. Milo didn't remember when he had last trusted humans. Perhaps it had been when he was very young, when his tiny neck could barely wear a leather collar, and the first hand that touched his head was the same one that taught him fear. The cold winter mornings, when the wind howled through the metal bars of the cage, Milo was dragged out into the yard, no matter if it rained or was freezing cold. Every time he barked from hunger, he was scolded. Every time he whimpered from the cold, he was kicked. And every time he tried to escape the pain, he was yanked back by a short leash that tightened painfully around his neck. Then, one day, for reasons unknown, the man pushed him into a water tank. Not for play, not for a bath, but to drown. That hand held his head under the water, without saying a word. Milo thrashed, panicked, clawing at the edge of the tank, his mouth filling with freezing water. For a moment, his heart seemed to stop beating. When he was pulled up, he lay gasping on the ground, trembling all over, and for the first time, his eyes were empty. Since that day, Milo never got close to faucets. He wouldn't eat if anyone was around. He wouldn't sleep when there were footsteps. And most importantly, he never initiated contact with anyone. For him, every touch was a risk. A tightening of the neck, a kick, a hand that didn't know what gentleness was. And yet now, the dog's head rested once more in the hand of a human, a boy, and Milo couldn't understand why he was doing it. This feeling wasn't like before. There were no shouts, no cold glares, no sharp wind cutting through the metal bars of a cage. Just the sound of slow, steady breathing. The scent of youthful skin mingled with the earthy smell of dirt on worn jeans. A scent of peace. He wasn't being pulled back, nor was he being pushed away. His head stayed there, on the leg of a person, not the one who had hurt him, but someone else. A different gaze, a different voice. Milo couldn't fully understand what was happening. He only knew that, in that moment, as the boy's eyes never left him, not forcing, not begging, just waiting, a very old door in his heart, a door he thought had rotted from being locked for so long, was quietly opening a small crack. And through that crack, light seeped in. Not bright, not blinding, just enough to make him not want to run anymore. Caleb didn't know what Milo had been through, but Milo sensed, with the strange instinct of a dog, that this boy was different from all the others. Not like the old man, not like the hands that had beaten him, not like the water that had drowned his breath. Because if it was the same, Milo would not be lying still now. He wouldn't have allowed his heart to touch another two-legged creature. And so that first touch wasn't just a simple resting of a head. It was an unspoken whisper. I'm not like them, and if you're brave enough to try again, I won't leave you. Milo gently pressed his head deeper into Caleb's hand. The evening sky was darkening, and the water in the canal rippled gently with the breeze. But in Milo's heart, all sounds faded away, leaving only one thing. For once, he would try to trust again. Are you trying too? Caleb whispered. I am. But I'm glad you started first. From a distance, Derek had stopped walking. He didn't speak, didn't call out, just stood behind a tree, his hand still gripping the car keys. The sight before him left him speechless. Milo, the dog he had thought for the past month was hopeless, broken, and beyond saving, now lay with his head resting on his young son, as if their souls had been separated in another life, and had finally found each other. In that moment, Derek understood that some bonds are not formed through training, not through reason, and not through force. They come from patience and trust that is sown through small, repeated acts, never giving up. He quietly stepped forward. Caleb looked up, his eyes bright with unshed tears, but not tears of sorrow. Dad, he let me touch him. Derek knelt down, wordlessly extending his hand. Milo saw him, immediately stood up, and took a step back. But he didn't run away. Derek stopped, his gaze softening, not with sadness, but with reverence. He understood that trust cannot be begged for, cannot be won by force. The dog had accepted one person today, and that was enough. Let me carry him, Derek said, stepping slowly toward Milo. Caleb remained by his side, one hand gently resting on the dog's back, an unspoken bridge between them. This time, Milo didn't resist. He trembled slightly as Derek slid his arms under him, lifting him gently from the cold water. But Milo's eyes stayed locked on Caleb, as if asking, "You're still here, right?" "I'm not going anywhere," Caleb whispered, as though reading the dog's thoughts. On the way back, Caleb wrapped Milo in a blanket, carefully drying each drop of water from his fur. He spoke softly about dinner, about the rug by the bed, about the stuffed bear named Binky that he would share with Milo if the dog wanted. Milo didn't respond, but he lay still, his head resting against Caleb's leg, as if he had found a soft place to breathe. Derek drove slowly, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, where a child was whispering to a creature that had once lost its trust. Inside him, something softened, like a door that had been shut for so long, now gently opening, thanks to an 8-year-old boy and a dog who had just taken the first step. The journey was far from over, but today they had touched each other. That evening, when the sky had darkened and the atmosphere inside the house calmed after a day full of emotions, Caleb quietly placed the familiar food bowl in the corner of the room, the same spot Milo had retreated to for the past month whenever everyone had left. But this time, instead of stepping away into the hallway as he always did, Caleb chose to stay. Not too close to cause pressure, but close enough for the dog to know that he was here and he wouldn't leave. Milo stood silently in front of the bowl, his body still hunched down, his eyes glancing at Caleb, as if waiting for him to get up and walk away, as he always had. But Caleb only smiled, resting his chin on his knees, and softly said, "You don't have to look. I just want to sit with you for a while. You can do everything your way." For a few seconds, everything seemed to freeze. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall and the faint light from the kitchen illuminated the room. Then, with a movement almost unheard, Milo lowered his head. He gently sniffed the food bowl, then began to eat. Small bites, slow and cautious, as if each chew was a step away from the darkness. Caleb didn't dare move. His heart raced with joy, but he kept his breath steady, as though trying to keep the rhythm of the moment. And then, for the first time since the dog had entered this house, Milo ate right beside him, without needing him to leave. For anyone else, it would have been just dinner. But for Caleb, it was a victory, a quiet proof that trust, no matter how small, can still grow, if we are patient enough to wait. After that night, when Milo first ate beside Caleb, something in the small house began to change. No one spoke it aloud, but the atmosphere seemed to soften. The tense coldness between human and dog lessened. The quiet doubt in Derek's eyes began to fade. And in that silence, the smallest sound, like the soft padding of Milo's paws on the wooden floor, suddenly became more precious than ever before. Caleb was the one who felt the shift most clearly. Each morning, as he flipped through his books at his desk, he no longer just heard the scratch of his pencil on paper, but the steady rhythm of Milo's breathing. The dog now always curled up at his feet, resting his head on Caleb's foot, as though it were the safest place in the world. At first, Caleb feared Milo wouldn't tolerate the noise of the pencil, the rustling of pages. But no, the dog would only blink slowly and continue lying still, his ears always perked up whenever Caleb read aloud. Caleb began to grow accustomed to reading his lessons to the dog, explaining every math problem as though Milo were a fellow student, and each time he always ended with, "See? We did it." Milo never answered, but Caleb believed, somehow, that he was still listening. As night fell, Caleb's room gradually gained a permanent member. The old round pillow by his bed, once used for play, had become Milo's sleeping spot. At first, the dog only lay there once Caleb had drifted off to sleep. But a few nights later, when Derek entered the room to check on his son, he found Milo resting his head on the rug, eyes shut tight, one paw still placed on the edge of the bed, as if keeping a silent promise that he would stay until Caleb was asleep. On early mornings, Before the sunlight broke through the curtains, Derek often heard Milo quietly following Caleb out to the backyard. The boy would water the plants, pick up fallen leaves, and chat about school and friends. Milo didn't run off, didn't hide in the bushes as he used to. He was still afraid of water. That hadn't changed overnight, but if the hose sprayed across, Milo would step back a few paces and wait, watching Caleb's every move with an oddly reassuring gaze. Once, water from the hose accidentally splashed onto Milo's paw, and he startled but didn't run away. He just shuddered once and stood still. Caleb immediately sat next to him, whispering, "I'm sorry. It's my fault, but it's okay. It's just water." Milo lowered his head, gently rubbing his nose against Caleb's sleeve. That gesture made Caleb smile, and from somewhere in the kitchen Derek paused, his gaze locked on the window frame. He saw it all, every small change, every quiet step forward. He no longer spoke negatively like before, but he still kept a certain distance. Not because he didn't trust Milo, but because he still didn't believe he could understand that creature the way Caleb did. Derek had once owned a dog, a golden retriever when he was still single. But that dog was completely different from Milo. Happy, outgoing, wagging its tail all day. Milo, on the other hand, was a closed-off world, where every action seemed to come from a place of darkness Derek had never ventured into. And what surprised Derek the most was that his son, an 8-year-old boy, could step into that world so gently and be accepted. One afternoon, after dinner, Derek stood leaning against the doorframe, looking out into the backyard. Caleb was drawing, sitting on the floor with colored pencils and papers scattered around. Milo lay beside him, his ears perking up whenever Caleb shifted positions, and his tail, which had rarely moved before, now began to sway slightly, as if following its own rhythm whenever Caleb laughed. Derek didn't call out, didn't step outside. He just stood there, still holding his cold cup of coffee. Watching the scene before him, he suddenly realized something simple, but which had taken him too long to truly feel. Trust doesn't come from forcing someone to believe in you. It comes from accepting them, even when they're not ready. And perhaps Caleb had never tried to train Milo. He just stayed, patiently, giving little by little, a piece of bread, a glance, a whispered word. Derek sighed, took a sip of his cold coffee, not tasting the bitterness. He knew he still had a long way to go to accept Milo's past, but at least today he no longer avoided it. He saw the dog, not as dangerous, not as broken, but as a creature learning how to live again, day by day. And he saw his son, a small boy, teaching the adults in the house how to befriend the invisible wounds that no one could see. That evening when Derek closed Caleb's door, he paused for a moment. Milo lay at the foot of the bed, eyes closed. But when Derek passed by, the dog slowly opened his eyes. Not in fear, not in caution, just opening his eyes. They looked at each other in a moment of silence that stretched. Derek hesitated, then bent down, extending his hand. Not to touch, just to get close. Milo didn't pull back. Derek said nothing, only nodded slightly. A nod acknowledging that. Perhaps the dog was trying too, and if a dog could try to overcome its fear every day, then shouldn't people do the same? That night, he slept better, for the first time since Milo came into the house. Because now Milo was no longer Caleb's dog, but was slowly becoming a part of this home. The rain began to pour around midnight. At first it was just a soft tapping on the tin roof, steady like the breath of a house deep in sleep. But then, the wind picked up, bringing with it gusts that slammed against the windows. Thick, rolling clouds swept across the sky, ready to unleash all their anger. The streetlights outside flickered in the storm, casting a dim light that made the trembling branches of trees dance on the ceiling. Milo was sleeping under Caleb's bed, curled up in the soft blanket. But unlike usual, his breathing wasn't steady. His ears were perked up, alert and uneasy long before the storm hit. And the booming sounds of the thunder had torn open old memories, rushing forth like an unstoppable flood. A sudden clap of thunder ripped through the night. The tin roof rattled violently. Milo bolted upright. He howled, a cry so agonizing, not the usual bark of a dog, but a sound that came from the deepest, tortured corner of his soul. His paws stumbled, knocking over a chair and sending it crashing to the floor. The noise was like a gunshot, and in the blink of an eye, Milo's eyes clouded, full of panic, as if he no longer recognized where he was. Caleb jerked awake. Before he could sit up, he saw Milo backing into the corner of the room, his body curled in on itself, whining like a small animal cornered and terrified. The look in his eyes wasn't the familiar Milo anymore. It was the old look, the look of the dog who had been thrown into the yard in the cold night, the dog who had been kicked whenever he howled in his sleep. The door to the room flung open. Derek rushed in, panic in his voice. "Milo!" Just hearing the call made the dog flinch. Milo slipped on the floor, crashing into the desk leg, retreating further into the wall. His body trembled violently, his tail tucked between his legs scrambling for a way out. But the room was closed, and the sound of the rain pounding on the windows made every escape seem impossible. Caleb reached out, but Derek stopped him, his voice full of concern. "Hold on, son. He's scared." "Dad, let me." Caleb's voice wasn't loud, wasn't urgent, but it held something that made Derek lower his hand. The boy didn't step forward. He only sat on the floor, a few steps away from the dog. The rain still roared outside, and in the dim light of the nightlight, Caleb spoke softly. "I know. The thunder scares you." Milo whimpered softly, almost sobbing. His whole body was still curled, his eyes unfocused. "Maybe you remember something really bad, right?" Caleb didn't move, his hand resting on his knee, open, empty. No treats, no leash, no demands. Just an 8-year-old boy sitting there, his heart wide open like a small flame in the middle of the storm. "But you're not there anymore," Caleb continued, his voice almost lost in the wind. "There's no water to drown you, no hand to strike your back, no one locking you outside. No one." Milo still didn't move, but his ears seemed to relax slightly. Caleb slowly crawled closer, bit by bit. He lay down next to Milo, not pressing close, just close enough for the dog to feel the warmth radiating from his body, like a quiet lullaby in the midst of the storm. "I'm not forcing you, but if you don't want to be scared alone, I'll stay here." Then Caleb wrapped his arm gently around the dog's back. Not tight, not pulling him close, just an embrace that was suspended, ready to loosen if Milo startled. But Milo didn't pull away. The dog's shoulders still shook. His chest still rose and fell. But he didn't pull away. Caleb tightened his hold just a little, pressing his face into the dog's back, whispering, "No one will hurt you anymore. This is home." The eyes of Derek, standing in the corner of the room, were filled with tears. Milo didn't howl anymore. He didn't whine. Under the small hands that held him, he just lay still, his eyes slowly closing, not from exhaustion, but from something that felt like safety, for the first time, in the middle of the storm. Outside, the sky was still angry. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The tin roof still trembled with each gust of wind. But inside the small room, all that remained was the sound of steady breathing and the heartbeat of a dog learning how to forgive the world that had once hurt him. Milo lay in Caleb's arms like a child being held for the first time after years of abandonment. And in that moment, in that space, he knew he was truly home. From the morning after, no one in the house needed to say anything, but everyone could feel that something had changed. Milo no longer hid under the table when Derek passed by. Instead of freezing like before, he would just tilt his ear, then quietly lift his head to look, his eyes no longer ready to flee. Each morning, when Caleb woke up, he would find Milo lying at the foot of his bed, and instead of shying away as before, the dog would nudge into his hand, gently rubbing his nose, then lying still as if to say, "I'm still here." Caleb could hardly believe the miracle unfolding before him. He would gently pat the dog's head, smiling all morning, constantly whispering, "See? No one's going to hurt you here." Derek also changed, though he didn't show it as openly as Caleb. But in the way he called Milo's name, no longer strained, in the way he sat pouring his morning coffee, his eyes lingering on the yard where Caleb played with the dog, there was a Derek who listened more, who was more patient. One day, he accidentally dropped his cup on the kitchen floor, and Milo flinched, breathing heavily for a moment before not running away. Derek bent down, picking up the broken pieces, his eyes briefly glancing at the dog watching from a distance. "Sorry, didn't mean to," he said quietly, and with sincerity. Caleb was overjoyed, so much so that every time he ran home from school, he would shout out loud from outside the door, "Milo, I'm home!" And every time, without fail, the dog would race out from behind the sofa, ears perked, tail gently wagging like a reed in the wind. Not in a frantic rush like other dogs. Milo didn't bark, didn't jump on Caleb. He just ran up, lowered his head, and touched Caleb's hand like a familiar greeting between two beings who had once been lost. Though Milo had begun to open his heart to Caleb and Derek, he still maintained invisible boundaries that no one else could easily cross. For him, the safe world was only contained within the presence of the two of them, one who had patiently sat with him under the rain, and one who had carried him in his arms when blood had dripped from his wounds. Anyone else who came into the house, even with a smile, a gentle voice, or a friendly hand, Milo would keep his distance. He wouldn't growl nor bark like other scared dogs, but would quietly step back, his eyes alert as if carefully scrutinizing every gesture, every footstep. Caleb noticed this, and he wasn't upset. He understood that Milo couldn't fully recover yet. Some wounds don't show on the outside. They lie deep within fractured memories, requiring time, a lot of time, to heal. So, whenever guests came over, Caleb would sit next to Milo, whispering,